Hello. I want to give you three prognoses of the way that the world economy might go. I've called it the good, the bad, and the ugly scenarios. And I've tried to write certain things on the board here, which I'm going to zoom in now, and as I talk you through what I think could be the good, the bad, and the ugly scenarios for the world economy in 2009 and beyond. And these are just my ideas. I don't know which of these is going to happen. Maybe it'll be none of these, or maybe it'll be something in between these. But these are just three possible scenarios. And it'd be interesting to know what you think is the most likely scenario, or perhaps a different scenario. So let's go through these. Let's start optimistically with the good scenario. So I'm going to zoom in now on the good scenario. Is that enough zooming in?
A bit more. Okay.
Okay, right. So here's what I see as the good scenario, which is the government overspends, but the budget deficits that it builds up as it overspends are seen generally as sensible, and that the government successfully restructures the regulatory systems of the financial markets and financial institutions, not just successfully, but transparently seen to be successful, which of course adds to the confidence that people feel, and that there is an international concerted action. Governments around the world work together to simultaneously try and stimulate the world economy, which is so important now that the world... Now, in this good scenario, the banking sector succeeds because toxic assets that we've heard so much about get isolated and perhaps stuffed into a bad bank that may get created. And this means that there is some growing confidence in the banking sector, that there is no more skeletons in the cupboard, so to speak. And as a result, stock market prices for banking stock rise, because they've collapsed, of course. Here early in 2009, they've collapsed enormously, but they can start to rise, and the interbank lending rises as well. Those interbank interest rates start to come down even more, and lending occurs between the interbanks, which allows the credit flows to pick up between banks and two firms and two customers, and credit starts to flow again. Across the broader economy and for consumers, the stimulus package that is passed in many countries, including, of course, that very big stimulus package in the USA, is seen to work. And actually there is a multiplier effect as well. So the money is spent, but then gets respent and respent and respent again. And that leads to growing consumption. Consumer confidence starts to rise as people understand that things are getting better. House prices stabilize, and then they start to rise along with share prices in stock markets. And the rising asset prices, this is people's wealth, of course, their property, stocks and shares, this causes a positive wealth effect, so consumption rises even further. And this is demand in the economy. So businesses start to sell more goods. And as businesses start to take on, sell more goods, they have to take on more workers, job creation, and they start to pick up their investment as well. And so slowly the... Okay, now the bad scenario. Well, governments find that the stimulus packages that they passed, the extra spending that they tried to pump into the economy, wasn't enough. And they need more fiscal stimulus. They need to borrow more and spend even more and cut tax even more. And this leads to higher and higher budget deficits among those governments that are doing this, which adds to their national debt. And doubt starts to grow. Doubt over whether small governments will remain solvent. There is doubts whether small governments who are borrowing large amounts to finance this fiscal stimulus can actually be trusted to pay back this money. When governments overspend, they finance that overspending through borrowing, which is usually through the sale of treasury bonds, 10-year treasury bonds. And as doubt grows about the security of those treasury bonds, the interest rates offered on the treasury bonds have to rise, because it's going to take a better and better interest rate to convince people to actually lend to these governments whom they maybe don't trust quite as much as they used to. And spreads will rise between the treasury bonds of different countries. So less trustworthy governments are going to have to offer bigger and bigger interest rates, and the spreads between the rates offered by more trustworthy governments and less trustworthy governments is going to grow. Even now, at the start of 2009, that spread is 2.5% between the interest rates offered on German 10-year bonds and Greek treasury bonds. Greek treasury bonds have a 2.5% better interest rate because it's so much more difficult, because people don't trust whether the Greek government can actually pay back their commitment over 10 years. So it's going to be more and more difficult, I'm saying, for governments to borrow, and yet they're going to have to borrow more as they are convinced that the stimulus packages are going to have to be even bigger. Governments may even start to default, and they may cut their spending on essentials. They may start reducing spending on education, healthcare, road building, to the point where even roads start to deteriorate and the infrastructure of the country starts to suffer. In the banking sector, in this bad scenario, there is more toxic assets discovered, more defaults occur amongst banks, there can be runs on the smaller banks as people doubt whether the bank is going to last much longer, and so they start taking their money out, and this further weakens the bank. Credit freezes up even more, business collapse is widespread in the private sector, and that leads to more bad debt and increased pressure on the banking system as the businesses that owe the money start to collapse, and perhaps even more scandals, like the Bernie Madoff scandal. Perhaps more scandals will emerge, which further weakens confidence in this damaged banking sector. In this bad scenario then, in the wider economy, maybe stimulus packages, there's no discernible impact, as I said. Maybe governments think they've got to throw more money into the economy. The public are not so convinced about the impact of the stimulus packages. And there are negative wealth effects as house prices and stock prices continue to fall, which makes people feel less wealthy, and then they have to, then they cut their spending even more. So spending declines further on the high street. I believe that tourism is really going to suffer in the summer of 2009, especially because this is what we call a good that has income elastic demand. So as people's income falls, they will cut their tourism spending enormously. It's one of those luxuries that one of the first things that people cut out of their budget. So I believe that countries that rely heavily on tourism are really going to suffer during the middle of this year, as they see that people just don't come and take their holidays there. There could be even deliberate defaulting by mortgage holders who are suffering from negative equity. The mortgage that they owe to the bank is far more than the value of their house, because the value of their house has collapsed. And so they may deliberately default. They may walk away from debt which is bigger than the asset they own. I mean, why try and pay more for something that isn't worth that much anymore? And of course there will be more actual repossessions of homes from people who genuinely cannot afford to pay their mortgage anymore. Perhaps there'll be a collapse of a large car maker. People talk about GM and Chrysler suffering, especially Ford less so. Maybe one of these is going to collapse, and all that goes with it, all of the millions of jobs and all of the supply chain earlier in the car manufacturing business. Very, very serious implications if one of the major car makers collapses. Unemployment growing steadily, and possibly the danger of deflation, falling prices. Demand is so weak that prices start to fall around the economy, and people put off their spending even more. A very bad scenario, but not the worst scenario. The worst scenario could be this dreadful, ugly scenario. Let me talk you through what I see as possibly features of a really seriously bad scenario, the ugly scenario.